I have a lot of respect for the people at the NRA, and I have already spoken to them on numerous occasions. And frankly, we need intelligent background checks, okay? There's nobody more pro-Second Amendment than Donald Trump. But I don't want guns in the hands of a lunatic or a maniac. But people have to remember, however, that there is a mental illness problem that has to be dealt with. It's not the gun that pulls the trigger. It's the person holding the gun. I'm also very, very concerned with the Second Amendment, more so than most presidents would be. People don't realize we have very strong background checks right now.
Oh, there's death and taxes and capitulation on gun control, things you know you can count on. It took Donald Trump just 2 weeks to go from we need intelligent background checks to, well, actually, we already have some pretty strong background checks right now. And he took it a step further today, directly contradicting a point he made at the beginning of all this.
Look, the NRA has over the years taken a very, very tough stance on everything. And I understand it. You know, it's a slippery slope. They think you approve one thing and that leads to a lot of bad things. I don't agree with that. I think we can do meaningful, very meaningful background checks. A lot of the people that put me where I am are strong believers in the Second Amendment, and I am also. And we have to be very careful about that. You know, they call it the slippery slope, and all of a sudden everything gets taken away. We're not going to let that happen.
Oh, it's a slippery slope, all right. A lot less sweaty in that second clip, thank God. That's the second time in the last 48 hours that Trump has publicly confirmed that he's lost his enthusiasm for background checks. And this comes as the New York Times is reporting that Mr. Trump had sounded less aggressive in private over the past week in discussions about possible gun legislation, a change that coincided with the NRA mounting a full court press. Coincided, that suggests coincidence. I'm not sure that's exactly accurate. And anyway, the Times also reports White House officials insisted that Mr. Trump would shift back again toward supporting more aggressive legislation in the fall when lawmakers return from their August recess. Yes, the very definition of kicking the can to Never Never Land. Joining us now, New York Times White House correspondent Michael Crowley. Michael, I ask you, given this display of craven backsliding, hypocrisy, self-contradiction, and mealy-mouthed talk coming out of President Trump over the course of the last week on this topic, are we now exactly where the most cynical people assumed we would be as soon as El Paso and Dayton happened, which is to say, nothing going to happen, Trump not going to help, nothing going to change?
Well, it sure looks that way, John. You know, and this is a familiar pattern, and I think that people were predicting it, and it's looking like they're being borne out. And, you know, what really strikes me here is the way in which Mr. Trump in the last few days has almost verbatim repeated some of the key NRA talking points. The one in particular that struck me, and he repeated it, I think we heard it from him on Sunday and then again yesterday, almost word for word, is the idea, I think the line is that the gun doesn't pull the trigger, the person pulls the trigger. That's not something I'd ever heard him say before, at least not in the last many months. Wasn't something he was saying, you know, a week or two ago, right after the shootings, and then we heard it a couple of days in rapid succession, and it really had the feel that somebody had, you know, sort of planted this in his head. And this is a president who's generally not scripted and sort of says what's ever at the top of his mind. And there are a couple other examples of this where we have just kind of very recently in the last few days started to hear him stick to talking points on this subject. So I think, yes, he's shifted course, and it sure feels like he talked to somebody who I guess you could say clarified his thinking on the subject.
Yeah, last person whose name rhymes with LaPierre, or actually is LaPierre. I want to read from, I want to give you this Axios thing about timing here, having covered that New York Times thing and said, well, maybe when he comes back in the fall, it'll all happen again. Here's what Axios says about the timing on this. It says that White House and Congress say it's September or bust on gun legislation. If new gun legislation doesn't pass in September, it won't get done before the 2020 election. Sources involved in the talks between the White House and Capitol Hill tell Axios it's September or bust, said a source involved in the discussions. We'll either have something ready for when Congress returns, drop it on the floor, vote on it, move on, or we blow it. So I go back to Crowley just to ask you, Crowley, or we blow it seems like the most likely outcome there, because given where the president is right now, and given that we know Republican lawmakers are not going to do anything without blanket cover from Trump, and August isn't that far away. It just seems totally implausible to me that we're going to come back after Labor Day and suddenly there's going to be a heated rush, given where the president is now and where we know Republicans always are, that we're suddenly going to see a heated rush towards getting something done.
No, it is hard to see. And I think, there are some Republicans who would need cover. There are some Republicans who would fight this. And I don't think the president has shown much of an appetite for fighting with Republicans, particularly on this issue. And look, there have been several issues on which Trump had an opportunity to go in a more bipartisan direction on various fronts over the past couple of years, and he just doesn't ever end up seeming to want to do it. His natural kind of safe place is to double down and stick with his base and to basically tell Democrats to take a hike. And it does look like that's where we're headed, and I think that would be the safe bet based on the prologue so far.
Yeah. Right. So, Charlie Sykes, I ask you this question. People say what Michael Crowley just said, stick with his base.
Right.
The president sticks with his base. I get that. He often does. A lot of politicians stick with their base. Here's a poll from the NBC and the most recent NBC Wall Street Journal poll in favor of that shows the polling on expanded background checks for gun purchasers. Look at the number right here. Look at that. 89%. So the president's base is about, let's say, 38, 41, some number like that. 89% of Americans support expanded background checks. So the president's base, 89% is pretty much everybody in the country, right? Which includes a lot of the president's base. This would not take courage to stand up to the base to be in favor of this.
There's a sweet spot. Obviously, background checks, maybe red flag laws, restrictions on the massive magazines on guns. But look, here's the moment where Donald Trump and the Republican Party are prisoners, are trapped by this base politics, because Donald Trump, they see those numbers. He's obsessed with those numbers. He understands that they pose an existential threat to the Democratic Party. They've clearly shifted rather dramatically. And actually, this is one of those moments where Donald Trump's gut instinct is to go with some form of gun control. He's a New York guy. He's indicated it before. And on issues like guns, like the issue of abortion, these are not visceral issues for him. This was a transactional position that he took. But because he is trapped, he's a prisoner of his own base politics, he cannot allow even an inch of daylight between his base and himself on an issue like this. And the one thing that the polls don't necessarily reflect is the intensity of the pro-gun movement. And they are bought in completely on that. Don't give an inch, otherwise it's going to be a slippery slope. So even though this is one of those moments where Donald Trump, I think, would love to move personally, the polls would indicate that it's almost a mandatory thing to do. He can't do it because of this base politics.
I ask you this, Tim. I mean, yes, I get base politics. When you're up to 90%, though, you're talking about a thing where a large chunk of your base agrees with expanding background checks. The base is, some portion of it is in that 11% that's against, or whatever's left, or doesn't have a point of view on it. But this is not one where it would require any political courage to do this when you're at 90 in favor of it. So you understand Donald Trump's mind to some extent, to the extent that it's possible to have understanding of such a strange and elaborate labyrinthine thing. What's in his head as he backs down and capitulates in this way in the face of Wayne LaPierre?
Donald Trump will never evolve. That was true during the campaign. It was true 70 years ago when he was 3 years old. It will be true for his remaining time on the planet. He is not somebody who's ever going to change his stripes. And right now what we're witnessing is Groundhog Day. February of 2018, he had the GOP leadership in the Oval Office. It was right after the Parkland shootings. On camera, he said, well, are all of you afraid of the NRA? I'm not afraid of the NRA. We need background checks. 2 days later, Chris Cox, running the NRA at the time, makes a visit to the White House, and Trump flip-flops. We've seen a little bit of progress. This time, it didn't take 2 days. It took 2 weeks. So perhaps if Trump is president for 100 years, we'll see him get to a place where he has principles that he holds on to and that he does the right thing. But he's not going to be president for 100 years, and I don't think we should expect him to evolve.
If you could do me a favor, never say the words, if Trump is president for 100 years, ever again at this table, if you ever want to be invited back. I do want to say one last thing, and though to you, Mara, it just goes to the Washington Post story that talks about a Republican poll that shows overwhelming support for stricter gun control among suburban women. 3 in 4 suburban women favoring stricter gun laws. And when you think about where this election, what happened in the 2018 midterms, suburban women who were normally Republican voters, who were upset by the way Donald Trump conducts himself, those same women in some of these key states that Trump managed to pull away from Hillary Clinton by the slimmest of margins, those women have a lot of reason to not like Donald Trump. This, it seems to me, is another reason. They're starting to look at this issue as a motivating voting issue. It's a security issue for their family. Is this not one more element of potential political risk that the president is bringing on himself by not going where 90% of the public is?
Absolutely. I think that second only to health care, guns and gun control was a massive issue in the 2018 midterms. And you saw it in these congressional seats, especially in places like New Jersey. And I just think it's a terrible issue for the Republicans unless they can get out ahead of it and say to the American people that they've actually done something, because they're going to have to answer for that. And the problem is this is actually an issue that has seen a lot of movement on the state level. So you have states even that have been held by Republican legislatures that have passed gun control in the past decade. And so when that's the case, I just think it's not a winning issue for the president. His instincts are leading him the wrong direction.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.